what kind of company, what kind of society. Of social giving itself good others that will lead to the synergy to get to that destination. This is very much of how we
Being of the crisis in our economy.
Very distinguished panelists, dear friends, ladies and gentlemen. It's an honor and a privilege to be bringing to a broad group of participants the 24th in the series of our conversations around policy issues in Nigerian history. Let me state again that the primary object of this series is to help us engage people who have been participant in the process of the formulation and implementation of policies in Nigeria from both the public and private sector through the years, in the hope that we can garner enough knowledge, intelligence, reflections from these players, such that a new generation of Nigerians who will make public policy tomorrow, who will provide leadership at different levels, the private sector, the public sector, the social enterprise sector, and so on, will be able to avoid mistakes that have been made in the past and be so proactive in their leadership that our country can gain traction in more areas and leapfrog stages of challenges in the evolution of our political economy. So it's a great honor and privilege to have as distinguished a panel as we have today, as we turn to yet another conversation in the oil and gas sector. We have in the past couple of months traversed a number of sectors from healthcare, which, as we know, is in particularly topical given the COVID-19 challenges, through manufacturing and other sectors of national life. We started oil and gas with a broad conversation with Chief Philip Asiodo, Dr. Imo Isweli, and others to provide us foundational insights into national oil companies and how we have managed to navigate the track. Today we begin what is a two-part really in looking at indigenous participation in the oil and gas sector. I think that we are favored to have from amongst the indigenous players someone of the level of engagement and commitment of a Dr. Patono. We have at the same time from the public sector point, the advisor to government at the time, a lot of policies were made regarding how to support the evolution of the indigenous sector. And then later on as GMD of the NNPC, Engineer Funsho Kukwulokun, who brings quite a rich history, given his career in the NNPC, to this conversation. We have others that we will introduce as they come along so that we don't spend all the time. I'd like to begin this conversation actually from Engineer Kukwulokun to ask if he could kindly give us a sense for what the policy choice issues were in considering fast-tracking indigenous participation in the sector, and his reflection on how far we've traveled with a sense for what could we have done differently, what did we manage to get right, and then we'll take it from there. Engineer Funsho Kukwulokun, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you to everybody. Now, national content is something we've been having all along. However, the only difference, it wasn't in a structured manner. It wasn't structured. Before I go to the National Content Initiative, let me talk about marginal faith. That was the first one that we decided that we let people participate in the industry. We've always heard of Shell, Mobil, and so on producing. Let Nigerians also participate in production. And I'm happy we have a live partner there. And we started the first program, formal program, bidding program in 2003. This went very well. 24 licenses were issued, and today a couple of them are producing. It wasn't quite as successful as we have wanted, because you see some of them taking one another to court and so on. Recently, like a year ago, the government decided to repeat the 2003 type exercise, and they reviewed what we did in 2003. Then some of the shortcomings they took out and improved on it. They've gone to tender. The process is still going ahead. But again, I guess in a few years, we see many more Nigerians participating in the industry through these two exercises. I must say, beyond these formal bidding exercises, we also have a few Nigerians that got into the industry. The first is Imo Isweli. Long ago, he started producing a small feed. Then Lai Fatono, with Niger Delta, they started producing. But these were small productions then, and there were not many of them. I think I can only remember those two. But by 2003, we had the first round of formal bidding for such an exercise, and that is going on. But now let's come to the important one. That is national content in general. So, like I said earlier, it is not something totally new. We've always had national content. However, what is the difference? It wasn't structured. And it started this way. You look at the economy in 2003 or so, you find out that there is no linkage between the economy and the industry spend. The industry gives revenue of close to 80%. And then they spend about 80% in the industry. But we are not able to see it being linked to the economy, because the linkage of the industry to the economy then was around 30%, which was very low. And we now said, okay, where is this coming from? And in those days, usually the president, once in a while, he will give what he calls mandates. And on this occasion, he told me and said, yes, the oil industry, we are doing very well. However, we are not able to link the spending in the industry with the economy. So we need to get onto that. And that actually is emphasizing on spend, domesticating spend, rather than indigenization. It wasn't indigenization. So Having said this, I then said to myself, what does this mean? And I need to see where we are. And the first thing is to say, for GDP to grow, for you to impact it, there were three levers that you can look at. One is attracting investments for growth. Oil production, we are doing very well. 35 million barrels a day, 35 billion barrels reserves, 2.5 million barrels a day. In fact, I remember February 18, 2006, we did 2.6 million barrels a day. I think that's the highest number in the country so far. So we are doing well, so that's not a big deal. In terms of gas utilization, 187 trillion cubic feet, and the only challenge is now to harness it to improve the economy. And so, again, we were doing well. The next is efficient in industry regulations and so on. Again, the PIB was already ongoing. The PIB that we are still talking about now, it was already ongoing, so that's not a big issue. But the big issue is in-country domiciliation and value addition, which is we call local content or national content, whichever one you want. So we see that this is the big challenge. We have to do this and get it right. We've been doing it, but it's not structured. How do we structure it? But before I go further, let me talk about an individual. One day, we used to have what they call chief officers' calls, and at the end of the chief officers' calls, that is done in Kaduna. Then we bring them. Then we have a ceremony. And so we were all there. The head of the class at the time, he had to make a presentation because the head of the class would then make a presentation. And this young man made a presentation that was so interesting to me and to everybody. So after the ceremony, which was about 1 hour, I then told Waziri, the group executive director, to say, please help me find him and come along with him to my office. I said, young man, I want to talk with him. So two of them came. I offered tea to both. And I said, young man, you made a presentation today. It was very impressive. I like it. But that's not why I'm calling you. I'm calling you because I now want from today go. I want you to work for me in my office. And I have a special project that I want you and me to work on. And that project is called National Content. It was very uncomfortable. I said, don't worry, you work with me and you work in my office. That young man was Ernst Nwapa. From that day on, we started working together. And I said, so the first question I now told him is, let us study what others do in other environments. What is it that they do that we have not done? Why is it that we are not structured in our approach in this thing? That's the first thing we must find out. So in that case, we then look at it, what others were doing. Malaysia was doing local content of about 70%, Brazil 70%, Norway 50%. So, okay, fine. We also found out that each of these countries link their national content with the oil industry. Everything they're doing in terms of national content, the oil industry is the driver. So, okay, fine. Now we must go to one of these two, either Malaysia or Brazil. So I selected Brazil and I said, okay, Wapa, we have to visit Brazil to see what they are doing, how they do it, why is it that they are doing it, that their case is more structured than ours. So we were in Brazil for 4 days. We visited several centers, including the Center for Ethanol is another town that we visited. But today we are not talking about the ethanol. So we then came back and wrote very voluminous reports to the president and said, okay, this is the situation. Now we are ready. We need to go ahead. We need to go into national content. And so at this point, it's now a question of how do we do it? What is it that we now need to do that is different? We now need to make it in such a way that we adopt a structured approach to national content. And to start with, we said, in terms of vision and strategy, what should we be looking at? First, organizational framework, the legislative framework we have to deal with. We have to roll out guidelines for compliance, and then we have to deal with capacity building. And then we selected a few areas that we need to focus on. And the focus was, one, procurement, because procurement forms more than 50% of the spend we do. Fabrication and installation, about 26%, and then engineering. So these were the 3 areas we focused upon. And then once we have done that, we now say, okay, there are other services that are related, that are linked, like banking and insurance, shipping and logistics. We also focus on them. So the next thing is to say, we know where we are, we know what we've been doing, but there is gap relative to what others do. So we started what we call gap assessment. So in terms of gap assessment, we looked at 4 key areas: human resources, fabrication, materials, and institutions, and so on. So for each of these, we look at what is it that we have on ground, and what is the shortage that we do not have? What do we need to do to get to that? And the gap analysis now, you'll be surprised. It reveals the following. Engineering, relative to what we needed in country as at that date, and I'm talking of 14 years ago, you needed 2,000 more of design engineers relative to what we had on ground. So we have to deal with that. We have to think of how we do that. Then engineering capability for major engineering projects. How do we get it? For major engineering projects, as at that date, zero, we didn't have a single company that could do. So at the end of the day, you now say, okay, you want to bring a vessel, everything has to be done outside. The vessel will come here. But we don't. So we started focusing on that. And today, I think we must have gotten one or two in Tinkham Island, for instance, they developed. Then another one that will surprise you, weathers. Weathers, they are very important in engineering. We found out that relative to what we needed, we had a gap of 8,000 weathers. We don't have them. They were nowhere. So again, how far we are now, I don't know. But we now need to focus.
It's a huge territory, and I can imagine that you can keep going at them, and I will return to you with that. NS Mwapa will also join us at some point and raise some specific issues. But I want us to start with broad policy strokes at this point, and then we'll get to some nitty-gritty details later. Like I said, we may probably do 3 or 4 episodes on this because it's such an important area. Now, in starting out, wanted to say, look, many countries that have become very proficient and dominate the value chains in which they are playing, which you entered with very little. South Korea, for example, in areas like shipbuilding and so on and so forth, often had a grand strategy. For example, Park, as president in South Korea, would typically say, look, we're doing a perspective plan. The perspective plan says we want to dominate shipbuilding in the world or be key players in 30 years. How do we approach this? And then they go to maybe some young engineers who work in some ship maintenance yard or something. And then they focus on them. Look, what will it take for you to be a major player in shipbuilding? How can the system support it going forward? That was, for example, a typical industrial policy approach of South Korea. We had different approaches in other places. Here we have Nigerians who worked for multinational oil companies, for example, people like Dr. Imo Itsueli, who from working in Philips, I remember meeting him when I just came back from the US at Philips, then continued to become an indigenous player. I'm going to turn to Dr. Lai Fatono at this point, and I'll come back to you to give the perspective from outside. What drove the ascendancy of indigenous players? What were the pains? How did they pressure the system to become more structured, if possible? I mean, in 1985, there was this conference in Nairobi about a tripartite approach to development. It was sponsored by the Aga Khan Foundation that talked about collaboration between the public sector, private sector, and PDAs, as they were generally called, private development agencies, in order to drive development. What kind of collaboration was built up? Was it just by chance, or just a doggedness of a play, especially in exploration and going forward?
Well, thank you very much. It's my pleasure to be on this panel. And it's very interesting listening to Engineer Kukoloku, and just like you said, I mean, he could go on till tomorrow morning to tell you the history of how things came to be. But you asked a relevant question. What is it can we or should we have done differently? We will come to that, obviously, because it would come to that. But I want to lay a very significant fact there on the ground, that Nigeria still has the most inclusive of participation by nationals in its oil and gas industry in Africa. In other words, what I'm saying here is that if you take Nigeria and any other country in Africa where there's a good history of oil and gas production, exploration, production, and whatever. You go from Egypt, you go to Morocco, to Algeria, you go to Angola, Gabon, Angola, Nigeria, currently Ghana, and fortuitously many other countries too. You will find that the Nigerian oil and gas industry has the most inclusion of indigenous companies participating. You obviously can say, well, after all, the oil industry in Nigeria is about 65 years old. But that is still not the issue. Today, we have scores of Nigerian independent companies. And the appetite is insatiable. There are a lot more struggling and fighting and struggling and just to get in. And I think if we stop the narrative with that observation and then start to look backward, what could we have done differently? And I will come back to talk about how the partnership of the private sector and the public, how did it come to gel in E&P? I would want to say that if you take every sector of our economy in perspective, take the finance industry, take the legal and judiciary, take the health, agriculture, the kind of people you find playing in those very strategic sectors of the economy are professionals. I don't know whether you, Pat, can go and open a law firm in Nigeria today.
It would not be allowed.
I don't know whether you can say, well, my name is Pat Utomi, I'm Dr. Utomi. I want to open an hospital and I want to be the chief medical consultant in the hospital. And if you go to agriculture, go to pharmacy, go to all aspects of our economy, even including banking, what you find are real hardcore professionals running and manning that aspect of even the private sector driven segments of the industry. Now, come to the oil industry. What do you find? All comers, everybody is in oil and gas. Whether they know what it is all about. I'm sure there are lots of people who are in oil and gas who have never seen, they don't even know what the color of crude oil looks like. And I would say that our industry, the oil and gas industry, has been the one that has been most proliferated. It's the one that has suffered the most of ingress and infiltration by people who just think it is just business. Well, of course, I agree. It is to a large extent, the oil and gas industry is a business, but it is a business for people who really know about the oil and gas industry. But so when we come to what have we done or what could we have done rightly that we didn't do, I think we got it wrong by allowing the ingress of non-professionals to become the masters of the industry. And I leave it at that. I won't say more. I would like people to examine that aspect of our being and really try to see what could we have gotten better if that aspect of the whole had been plugged? Or what could we have gotten worse if actually we plugged the hole? Now, so let me then come back to your very pointed question. The collaboration between the private sector and the regulators and the government national industry has been very, very one-sided in that more international oil companies have done far, far better simply because they've been here for very, very long. But what you see today that I described to you, that there are a lot of successful Nigerian independent companies that have emerged. It has not been a very, very easy walkthrough. It has been bare knuckles, it's been brawl, it has been brains, it has been sheer doggedness, perseverance, and just remaining focused. Otherwise, you would not have been able to achieve anything. And I would then move forward that for the Nigerian petroleum industry, for the oil and gas industry to actually take advantage of whatever it has lost, there has to be better professionalism, and there has to be substantial encouragement for indigenous participation, particularly for those that have proven themselves, those entities, companies, individuals that have shown what they could do when things are really, really, really not well caught up. If you can see what it is they have done and try, just like you said, have a deliberate policy of saying Nigeria wants to be so in 2040. We want to be producing whatever it is, and of which this will be done majorly by Nigerian independently owned companies. So let me stop with those openers that I have thrown out.
Thank you so very much. Appreciate that introduction. Usually when this conversation takes place, the importance of indigenous play is built around impact on the economy, because the indigenous players tend to act in a way that has a greater knock-on. When we had the session on gas a couple of weeks ago, quite a bit of the conversation between Babs Omoto, I think Dr. Heitu and somebody, was about what prevented that from happening in Nigeria for gas to have a greater, knock-on, if you will, to the local economy, creating more jobs, creating more indigenous players on the value chain of gas. I want to turn to Otumba Tunji Lawal-Sholari, who is an economist by training and has played in this industry for, I guess, upwards of 40, 50 years, and to get a perspective from the long play, from downstream where he started, on what could have been done differently. How could this sector have evolved differently that would have had greater impact on the Nigerian economy rather than just revenues that flow in from crude oil sales?
Thank you, Pat. Good evening, gentlemen. I think that I wanted to react to the points made by Dr. Kupolokun very shortly, and also made by Dr. Fatono, because I found them very, very relevant, very remarkable. The first one is on the Nigerian content development as we speak. And I was quite touched and very impressed by the way he identified one of the good players in the Nigerian content or national content sector. That's Ernest. And I think that NS has proved himself in terms of his track record in the industry. But I think there's this debate always going on how do you define Nigerian content or the national content. I was speaking with a couple of years back. I was involved in some discussion with a banker, and he was saying that, oh, we're doing very well in the oil industry in terms of funding. And I said, oh, wow, that's good. We are supporting Nigerian content. Well, actually, what he was talking about when I got down to it was we were trying to market some projects for him to get involved in, was that, we've given a lot of support to generators and air conditioners for supplies by one of the vendors. And I just smiled at him. That's what content is that? Is that Nigerian content and local content? Well, that is something I'm sure that NS will want to react to, because I still want strongly with the extent of the depth of Nigerian content in the oil industry is still a question that has not been answered. And I'm sure that Dr. Okubolokun will want to say something at NS too, because Pat, you said something very, very crucial. The South Korea model, for example, in shipbuilding, is second to none in the world. And for God's sake, oil industry, oil producing countries go to South Korea to sign FPSO shipbuilding contracts, and they don't have any oil, if I recall. That is something visionary we can do to be able to build a capacity for something niche in the oil industry, in the whole chain. Look at what area you can. I mean, you have people like Najadok, and you have people like Ladol trying to do something like that. They've been struggling. I know firsthand. They're struggling to have the enabling environment to be able to do it. But we have a fantastic opportunity to do that. So again, how far have we gone with Nigerianization, internalization of the Nigerian content is still issues we have to also look at. The second one I think is so important is the issue of capacity building, human capacity building. And I heard Dr. Okubolokun reading of 2,000 welders, so many social engineers, so many designers. I know one of the companies in the industry today that have done very well in that area. I'm sure you know Dr. Fawibe, International Energy Services. I mean, he has probably 200 or 300 engineers working on so many things. Nigerian trained. It's a success story. So something is happening. A little bit is happening. We need to also showcase most of this and much more. We can have a hub. I remember about 5 years ago, I was in China, in Shanghai, actually, with a team from GE. They're trying to see how they can bring some engineering team. Well, I was with them in Holland, in Shanghai, in Chicago. They were doing some road shows because they believe strongly in African rising. One of their CEO, Global C Africa, Ireland, Mr. Ireland was so passionate. So I was going with them, trying to see how we can do something in Nigeria. And they went as spending quite a lot of money in Calabar to set up a hub there. Again, to design, to build up capacity. But again, something happened within the G hierarchy. They couldn't get along with it. They spent a lot of money. The facilities are still there, and they're trying to look at how they do it. But I'm just to say that that is something we can latch on as someone developing a specific capacity to do things, capacity building, human capacity building, and also a hub for a niche area of the supply chain or the value chain from the upstream to downstream oil industry. So let me just make that point very clear. The other point I'd like to make is the point made by Dr. Fatono, which actually, he said it when he started talking. I wasn't sure, but he was referring to the fact that cowboys, I want to quote him, incursion into the oil and gas industry. That is a very telling statement. I learned a lesson talking to, because I do multivarious things, even though I've retired, but I get involved in a couple of things. I learned a lesson talking to a professor of agriculture, and he's a World Bank FAO consultant, Nigerian. And we're trying to do some training for young people in my locality, and we developed some models for that. We asked him to come in and do it. And he said to us, well, the problem with Nigerians is that they want to go into farming. And they want to go into farming, young people, and they say, give me money. I want to buy some appliances, or get me some seedlings, some fertilizers. I said, it doesn't work like that. You got to train to be a farmer. You have to be trained to be a farmer. People just want to go to the farm and just start farming. They're not trained. So it developed a model for us to train people, training farmers alone, nothing else. And 3 days ago, I had a wonderful experience with one gentleman from Port Novo, Shongai Farms chairman. Incredible experience. I spent a whole day with him. Again, he has emphasized that point. So let me go to what Lai is saying. Lai is saying to us, in effect, that one of the problems we have in the oil industry today is that too many cowboys. People just say, oh, you say, how are you? I meet you at a cocktail or somewhere. You say, how are you? How are you doing? What are you doing now? I'm in oil and gas.
Oil and gas.
Last time I checked, the lady was a trader. But how did he get into oil and gas? Because he's supplying diesel now all over the place. It's into oil and gas. And it's happening. It's really happening. And the reason why it's happening so seriously is because of government interference and intervention. Because people think that rent-seeking people can go to Abuja, I'm sorry to say, to be blunt about this, and collect some documents, some papers. I'm sorry, either to even get a marginal feed, or even to get some oil blocks, or even get some allocation. And the professionals are pushed aside. I have a small experience trying to set up a company. And from the get-go, I knew I was going to have to face what Fatona called cowboys. But at that time, in the downstream sector, those who are making most money are people who can get connection in Abuja and just collection to import diesel or PMS or to get allocation from refinery. So I'm just trying to say that this issue of professionalism required to build the oil industry is one of the cause of government intervention and the Nigerian spirit. You know, Nigerians are the most, and I agree with him completely. Entrepreneurs of Nigerians, as at last count, I did some small research on that. They are in not less than 10 countries in Africa. Nigerians are in Mozambique, they're in Angola, they're in Namibia, they're in Ghana, they're in Uganda, they're in Sudan, Nigerian professionals. And they are well recognized and appreciated. I was in South Africa and they were telling me, Namibian groups were telling me, we have a Konda, the gas field in Namibia, very prolific. They actually didn't want to use Africans. They want to use Nigerians to help them develop that gas field. In Nigeria, a Namibian team told me that. So I'm just saying that we have so much we've gone for, but we need to find a way to develop this thing further and articulate it and put it in a very structured and focused position that people can be able to benefit from by Nigerian professionals. Thank you.
It's interesting that you say that. Thank you so very much. Many years ago, when Pepple was acting GGM at NAPIMS, I had a conversation with him and in which I said to him, look, a lot of quality people who have been trained in the NNPC system, they've retired, some of them retired early, and they're in Ikoyi Club at night, drinking their beer and telling stories, that it would be an amazing national strategy to put them together and create teams, if you will, call them fire teams that go in to help all these African countries that are just getting into oil and gas, how to deal with multinational oil companies, how to deploy some specific skills, and here I'm going to turn to Ernest. The business of, I mean, Chukwulukun talked about the gaps that were identified in the studies in the early days. I know, for example, that a country like Egypt, as way ahead as we may think we've gotten, they become the source that the world turns to for underwater painting, for example, or whatever, because one person focused on this and they began to generate human capital around that area. Just like the Filipinos crew ship around the world and so on and so forth. Perhaps let's begin with your looking at what the possibilities are of Nigeria seeking to dominate particular skills in the oil and gas business, and what could be done to get us to say where Egypt is with underwater painting or whatever.
Okay, thank you, Pat. Respect to all my elders, my Oga at the top, Engineer Kuboloku, and my colleagues. Yeah, this is an interesting discussion. The indigenous participation philosophy for Nigeria actually started almost at the same time the industry started. That desire has always been there. And even when a national oil company was set up, one of the driving forces was to promote indigenous participation in the industry and to create more value in country. The Petroleum Act, the JOAs, the agreements with the international oil companies all had aspects of indigenous participation. The aspirations were always there. Now, as Engineer Kuboloku said, different people were treating these aspirations differently. But it got to a point where it became necessary to have a focus and to bring these ideas together and make them implementable and actually implement them. That is where the change occurred. Now, the good thing about that change is that it was driven from the top by a president that was involved and by the top management of NNPC led by Engineer Kuboloku. Before that, there had been several committees. In fact, there was a committee on local content that had been set up and a lot of studies, a lot of individuals, a lot of NNPC staff had participated, holding discussions, bringing up ideas of how to build these capacities, what the indigenous players in the industry at that time wanted to see in the oil and gas industry, which areas we should focus on. In fact, we had also collaborated with the Norwegian government, who set up a study called the INSOC study. And that study looked at the areas of high impact, areas that we would benefit more, and areas that we would quickly ramp up in such a way that they would have more value addition to the national economy. As you know, one of the major things that we were also doing at that time is everybody was more interested in the revenue. We needed to start looking more at the value addition rather than getting revenue and then just paying a revenue from sales of crude oil and then royalties. We identified those things, and one of the major drivers, what we call the cornerstone development that we targeted, was the FPSO integration. And when that picture came up, a lot of people said, that's too ambitious. Where are you going to build the FPSO? Who are the people going to design it? Who is going to, where do we have the capacity to do it? And it was a deliberate strategy that type of facility would attract every other thing. If we get it, it will attract every other thing. And as far back as 2004 or 2005, we started writing guidelines because there was this issue about legislation. Do we go for legislation or do we just use government policy to drive these developments? We believe that the industry needed to be mobilized to come together and get everybody working off the same worksheet and then identify the strategy that will give us the best result. That's why the OPTS, which is the group of the international oil companies and a few others, the indigenous oil producers, the PETAN, which is the Petroleum Technology Association of Nigeria, and several other stakeholder groups. We had what we call the Nigerian Content Consultative Forum, and it is in that NCCF that we identified that we could actually develop a crop of engineers and welders that will make Nigeria a hub for fabrication in the whole of the sub-region. And that's the way we approached it. At the same time, the indigenous promoters, producers, were fighting for development of their marginal fields, trying to get government to support their activities around development of those marginal fields, because those licenses were there, but nobody was actually activating them in terms of production. So we have a few strong Nigerians that scraped through to get their own production going. And people like I see Austin Avro there. These guys and people like them fought like they were using shoelace budgets to get their own operations going. And one of the thoughts we had is that the only way those companies can survive is if we have the capacity in Nigeria. If we depended on international capacity to run those operations, it didn't have a chance of survival. At the beginning, the indigenous service provider costs were higher, but we believe that over time the benefits have started showing. For instance, during the COVID, during this our COVID exposure, a lot of people capacity went out of the country, but the residual capacity within Nigeria still allows us to do so many things. Those capacities were not in existence 10 years ago.
Yeah, it's important to make that point because one of the key challenges that COVID showed is that when global supply chains break down, that is when you truly value that you have indigenous capacity in many, many areas, across industry sectors. This was a big thing. But Ernest, we'll come back to you. I know that Austin is there, but one of those on the participating is an old NMPC person, Engineer Mansour Ahmed, and he's been indicating a desire to make a comment. So I would like us to take his comment or question and then return to Austin and back to Engineer Kupoloku.
Thank you, Professor. I hope you can all hear me.
Yes, indeed.
I've listened to, thank you. I've listened to most of the very erudite presentations by this very high-level panel of very experienced oil people. And I dare to make this comment because I have worked with many of them, and I know there are people who mean well for this industry. And I believe that the views I've had are views that are coming, perhaps driven by some level of frustration of the core subject matter. Why has Nigerian oil and gas industry grown and made the impact that we're looking for? Now, I think perhaps because we are talking to ourselves, perhaps because we are all internal people. We are all industry experts. I have a sense that we have missed the essence of this question. First of all, we should be asking ourselves, what does it take for an industry to grow and to make the impact on the economy and on the life of the people? I think that's the key question. Now, if that is the case, then I think we need to be talking about 3 or 4 key things. First of all, we must be talking about government policy. Do we have a government policy regime that focuses on growing the industry in a manner that it will impact the life of the people, in terms of ensuring that the industry grows and to the benefit inclusively? That's the first one. So we must interrogate government policy and find out, has our policies been, if you like, geared to do this? Secondly, as indeed most of the speakers have highlighted, obviously we need knowledge and skills, because especially in an industry like that, which is complex, we cannot expect to grow it unless we create and build and sustain in an inclusive manner the knowledge and skills that are necessary for that industry to grow. Now, the third is investment. Now, we need an industry where investment is defined, is recognized, independently of the operations of the industry. Yes, I'll just take 2 minutes, Prof. Now, it seems to me that in our perception, when a medical doctor who is obviously not versed in oil and gas industry seeks to invest in the industry because he's an entrepreneur, he sees the business as a business. He's not caring whether it is a specialized business requiring some specialized skills. So he sees it as an entrepreneurship opportunity, and he invests. Now, what does our policy encourage people like that to invest? And if they do invest, are there opportunities where they can now invest as investors, but also make sure that the skills and knowledge that is necessary to make this work there? If we don't pursue this discussion along these lines, we will continue to speak about cowboys, people who come and invest in an industry where they have no knowledge of. Now, if that's a cowboy, then it's a stupid cowboy, because an investor who is willing to put his money in something, unless he understands that there are skills and knowledge he has to bring into the business and make it work, there's no way that investor, that cowboy cannot be but a stupid cowboy. But let me stop here. I hope I've been heard. And I'm saying this with all honesty, that I think this discussion is very valuable, but I think we should frame it in a way that will make sense. Thank you.
Well, thank you so very much. I think that this is a valuable touch to the direction that we're traveling. And I would like to turn next to Austin Avru, who was soldiered through a bit of these early stages. And he can give us, and the thing is that Austin is very stout with his views. I remember at one of the oil industry events many years ago, I was speaking alongside him, and I think I made some very strong remarks. At that point, I think there was a change in managing director, a group managing director of NNPC. And I said, if I hear one more change in NNPC group managing director in the next 1 year, I'll move to Fernando Po or somewhere like that. And Austin warned me that I might be setting myself up for a move very quickly. so, Austin, I have not moved yet to Fernando Po.
There probably have been 7 GMDs after that threat you made. Thank you very much, Prof, and everybody. And I'm happy to continue very quickly in a couple of minutes from where Engineer Mansour Ahmed dropped off, because we've had very, very intriguing stories from Ernest and Oga Engineer Kuboloku. And those are stories of the experiences of people who sat down to put valuable policies in place. And so the question is, where do we always drop off? And let me even start by saying, I don't worry about all-comers in any industry. We had 126 banks. On the ashes of 100 of them, 24 have emerged, out of which we have about 6 strong banks. There's really nothing wrong with all-comers. Proper regulation will distill the serious investors from the all-comers. So that's the point I want to touch on. Policy, regulation, and failure of policy. So you put a good policy in place, the regulator and the regulatory framework ought to drive that policy to definite milestone achievements, clearly outlined. So in 2001 to 2003, Engineer Kubolokun came up with the Marginal Fields Program. It's easy to look at the failure part of it, but out of the 24 marginal fields, in 10 years, 8 of them were producing. 3 of them had metamorphosed into bigger companies. It has taken 18 years for a continuation of that policy to try to create other marginal field operators. And in the process, 18 years later, I'm asking myself, since 2003, what has the regulator done? So we had 24 marginal fields, 10 on production. Did the regulator ask himself, what next? Those who have succeeded, what do we expect of them? Where do we drive them to? When some of us, came together and created Seplat, and Niger Delta created ND Western, those successes were in spite of and not because of government or the regulator. And it ought to be the other way around. Those successes should have been driven by regulation based on what were done in the Marginal Fields Program. So what I'm saying is a proper regulatory framework implementing government policy should continuously be asking himself, if this is where we are today and this is where we're going, what adjustments do we need to make to get to where we're going? So if 8 marginal fields are on production out of 24, it is the regulator who should be asking, what do we do with this 8? How do we build further capacity? What is lacking? But on the other hand, when these 8 operators who are successful, grinding to that success, as you said, try to then up the scale and move to the next level, the regulator and government become an obstacle in terms of getting approvals and so on. And indeed, the so-called cowboys will get approvals long before the ones who are moving legitimately to the next step. So, and it's not just here, it's not just in the oil and gas industry. As long as regulation is not targeted at the implementation, full implementation of government policy, we'll all continue to wonder. I mean, Engineer Mansour Ahmed, I'm sure will tell you that they are building a 650,000 barrel refinery, not because of some real well thought out and focused government policy that drove them to that point. It's actually in spite of government policy that are succeeding. And then when they succeed, government will jump on the bandwagon. It's the same thing everywhere. Perhaps the only one that has been properly regulated stage by stage to get them to the point where they're successful is the banking sector. Understandably, because they're using other people's money. So you can't look away. You can't look away when they're using other people's money. Other than that, in every case, as you mentioned South Korea, you still want to be shipbuilders. So at every stage, the regulators and government policy implementation do we need to do to get to that point. But here, either the regulation becomes a roadblock because approvals are needed, and approvals means that the person giving the approval is powerful, and because it's powerful, everybody will lobby around him, and the process approvals might be given to the so-called cowboys instead of those who should be given to. Or indeed, as we're now seeing, the regulator becomes a source of revenue for government. That's the only emphasis. So we're doing marginal fields so that we can collect $1 billion for government. We're not doing marginal fields 18 years later so that we can grow on the successes of the one that happened in 2003. We're doing it so that we can collect money for government. So where regulation is either not focused or becomes actually the albatross of the industry itself, we can talk from now to tomorrow, those good policies that were put in place ultimately will go the way of other policies, and that whether it is the shipbuilding fund policy, whether it is aviation, they will go the same way. It is regulation that ensures that a properly put together government policy is implemented over time, irrespective of who is in charge. Now Engineer Kubolokun is gone. NS Nwapa is gone. Luckily, the local content team, they are still doing well. But I can almost bet you that in the next 10 years, the focus of NCDMB will not be the same thing as what it was originally designed by NS Nwapa and Engineer Kupoloku. Because now it's a powerful place. There are hundreds of millions of dollars to be given out as funds for those who are coming into the industry. And once those privileges surround an office and they're available to be dished out, as perks and privileges, then again, regulation, we lose the focus and become either, as I said, either a roadblock instead of being an enabler. So really, all I'm speaking about is the failure of regulation is the reason these policies are not taking us anywhere. The few cases where you have seen success, whether it is in refining, whether it is in the upstream where we are, and to a large extent, even in the service sector, it is in spite of and not because of any real targeted regulatory attempts to take us to the next level. Thank you.
Thank you so much. You make a very, very important point here. I know that I am known for repeating very frequently that I believe that the greater risk of business in Nigeria is not market risk, that it is regulatory risk. Even the banking industry that, Austin, you think, I think the biggest problems banks have is the regulatory scheme over the industry, but that's another matter. What can we do to build a regulatory capacity in our country? Now, here's my perspective, and I'm coming back to Engineer Kupoloku on this matter. I have a sense that there is something in our general culture that authority sometimes just converts people to bullies rather than builders. I don't know, I can be completely on the left field on this matter, but I see the last mile official becoming a terrorist because he's wearing that uniform. The policeman because he's wearing this uniform. The customs official, this. So power, I hate to do this, but my favorite definition of power goes back to 1956 and an American called Robert Dahl. Power is the ability to make A do what B would not ordinarily want to do. The inability of A over B to make him do what he ordinarily not want to do. How can we either educate or regulate regulators so that they are more focused on the long-term common good of all than on the appreciation of the power that they have for this moment? Because it seems to be fundamentally at the heart of the problem of enterprise in our country. In the oil industry case, specifically in mind, Engineer Kupoloku, could you reflect on what the challenges are and what we can do differently? Because usually it's easier after one's own tenure to look back and see things that are happening after you and wonder, should the regulator have behaved differently? I mean, just turning back to banking that Austin used as an example. I was at Wharton on a program a year after Nigeria's great banking reforms. And the speaker there was from Pricewaterhouse USA, one of the partners, said that he's never seen a country do the kind of damage Nigeria did to itself last year. Woke up one day without priming, get into this, whatever it was, and halved its own value overnight. He says he never had that in the history of regulation, and that's what Nigeria did. But here we're hailing the then central bank governor for what he did with stress tests and all of that. And the Pricewaterhouse lead partner for finance in the US was saying he's never seen any country do that kind of damage to itself. So what do we do about reforming regulation, in this case specifically for the oil industry, so that the points that Austin was making can be borne in mind? The Koreans, their goal was to grow that sector. And they were effectively able, through regulation, to be more stimulating and pushing of the greater good of the economic thrust of South Korea than the power interests of those who were in those positions, as it were, at that time. Please unmute.
Let me start, not necessarily disagreeing with you, but I want to say that for me, in terms of regulation and regulatory systems, the banking sector in Nigeria seems to be the most regulated. I wouldn't say is well regulated, but they are far more regulated than any other sector, far more regulated than the oil industry. And they could do better, and they should do better, you know. Now, let's come to our own industry. Everton was concerned about all commerce and so on. And Austin Avuru says he doesn't have problem with an all-comer nature of the industry where anybody just jumps in and so on. But what is required is a regulatory framework that makes people do the right thing. I think I agree with Austin Avuru. You can't say this is an industry for X or Y, and therefore Z should not play. But let Z come and play. But let the regulation, the regulatory system be such that you, the Mr. Z that is coming to play, you have to go along with it. So what we require is better regulatory system, which we all agree. I think I hear everybody saying the same thing. The next question is, for our own industry, how do we get that? Now, you see the government, you see the different players. It is important to get people at the top level to really find out what the problems and the challenges of today are, and then build regulatory systems that will take care of that. So you're talking of the minister, you're talking of the GMD, you're talking of the director of DPR. They have a duty to look in depth into what is looking like a gap in today's terms in our own area, and let them do something about it. Let them improve the regulatory system to make sure that things can work more properly. That's the way I see it. But that is not happening today. In fact, sometimes when people talk of regulation, it is for another purpose, not for the right purpose.
Okay, let me ask you to please continue down the track of, if reflecting on the way things are in the face of general speculations. You know, for years, I think, I guess at the conference that I mentioned that Austin and I spoke at, I remember my subject that year was on peak oil. And today, we're not talking peak oil anymore. We're talking about people like Total, in their books, writing down crude oil holdings in Canada to zero about 17 years or so from now. There's general perception that the fossil fuels business is almost running its course, and that energy is going to be coming in alternative forms. What should be the consequence in our general thinking about the oil industry, how to develop it in the face of these kinds of challenges? And then, quick closing thoughts of what we should be doing to safeguard our energy future and, the fact that this has been a mainstay of our economy for a long time. So I want to start with you again, Inakbuluku, and then same reflection from all of the panelists.
Okay. Everybody is aware.
I think your volume is a little low.
Okay. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, but it's very low.
Yes.
Maybe a little voice projection. Sorry.
Okay. Everybody is aware of what is happening, and
yes,
everybody is concerned. Will I say concerned, or However, for me as a person, I don't think things are going to run as fast as we see, because while we are moving away from fossil fuel and so on and so forth, it's not going to be the same thing in Africa, in Nigeria. It will take a little longer. We use our own oil. That's the way I see. We are not on the way they are talking about it in the UK and in other countries. It's not going to be the same way it's going to impact us in Nigeria. But we have a duty to begin to figure what to do in the circumstance of this trend, because things are moving, and we have to know that maybe in 30 years from now, we are not going to be where we are. And there are so many areas. In terms of revenue, I can see the thing that happened in National Assembly with respect to the PIB. So you get the bulk of the money from oil. If oil is going to go out, what do we do? How do we play it? How do we move away from it in terms of revenue earning? What is it that we should begin to focus on that. We should also, we're talking of local content today. What we are doing now, let's also build systems that can remain and expand into other areas. Like you're talking of what Ladol is doing, you're talking of what Jamakani is doing. Let's do the big things that we can make money from, other than just talking about earning money from oil.
From crude. Yeah. Okay, thank you. To Dr. Lai Fatuno, some reflections on these and how the industry can be expected to evolve, and what the Nigerians who have developed capacities in the industry should be looking at the future, short term, longer term.
Thank you very much, and it's very, very exciting, and as usual, very refreshing listening to Ernest and Austin and Engineer Manso. And Otumba, thank you very much for your contributions. Just a few thoughts about old thoughts, and I would say these are because in various other opportunities where I've had the chance to say what I feel and what Nigeria should do in the face of these so much talked about energy transition. Just like Engineer Kufoloku said, Nigeria and the rest of Africa, it's not going to happen tomorrow. And Nigeria is unique in the context that we have well over 200 million people to cater for. And when you look in the space of energy and availability and affordability, Nigeria is still some very, very substantial depth in inadequacy. So I strongly believe that the energy transition and the way we're talking about it, the rest of the world moving away from oil, I think this is an opportunity for us to use this space, this happenstance, as a catalyst for transformation, for industrialization, and for holistic national development in a way that really, really brings to us the benefits and the full-fledged energy security and independence, which we occasionally we talk about it, but I still don't believe we are talking about it in a very, very consistent and that with passion and attention. How can we bring energy? And when I talk of energy, every Nigerian wants to ride a car, wants to go from point A to point B, which are all dependent on availability of energy. How can we bring energy to every Nigerian in a way that he gets it when he wants it, he gets it at an affordable price? We're talking about so many million liters of refined products crossing the border. Well, it would ultimately happen, and it is just a manifestation of the fact that there's need for energy, even outside of the borders of Nigeria. And this is an African story. This is an African problem. Everywhere you go in Africa, there is inadequacy of available energy in the context and in the form that is available when they want it, and in a way that is affordable to them. So just in a nutshell, I think the opportunity of the energy transition, creates a space for Nigeria to reinvent itself and to actually achieve all these things we have been talking about since we started the opening discussion about having a niche, building capacity, and doing other things for the benefit, and I say, of every Nigerian.
Yeah. Let me just keep to Ernest here again. Ernest, we're talking about the future. Engineer Mansour Ahmed has just made a comment about the fact that we're like having a chat amongst retirees and not focusing on the future. If you had to take the future in mind and counsel those who are in the Nigerian content program, what would you be saying to them?
Yeah,
what should they be looking at doing?
Yeah, from the get-go, when we tried to do Nigerian content in the oil and gas industry, it was not supposed to stop there. It was just the oil and gas industry was supposed to be a launch pad for the greater economy. So, having modeled the Nigerian oil and gas industry and seen the success, we expect the government, the industry, the economy to go into this model and practice it in power, in transportation, in telecom. So the government had an executive order, I think executive order number 6, that tried to promote local content across the entire economy. But who is looking after it? Where is the equivalent of NCDMB driving that process? there's been a lot of talk about railways and the transportation sector. The capacity that has been built in the oil and gas industry is too much to service only the oil and gas industry. We knew it all along, but we need to make that connection in the government. I wrote, I consulted for the National Assembly, where it would be nice to have a council on national content, where maybe 6 ministers are meeting and talking to each other about collaboration. There is no reason why even if we can do the trains, the engines of the trains, the cabins, the passenger units can be fabricated in Niger Dog or Lador. We don't have to wait for another FPSO before there is work there. So what happens is we build this capacity. We have the best welders in Nigeria. We have welders qualified to do most of the things. We build the internals of ships right here in Nigeria. But we are not using that capacity to service other sectors. By now, the power sector,
as you know, for several years, I used to host, along with Engineer Krager and Dr. Lola Mao, a series on Nigerian content at the Lagos Business School. How do we build the Nigerian content? And one of the things that I used to say as long ago as 20 years ago, taking a view of oil as time limited, if you want, is that we need to build capacity from the oil industry that sees ladders of opportunity in which the same people who are in oil today can go to the next level of understanding where energy will be going and scope economies from that base to do several things. And to energize that out of, say, the Nigerian content program, I wonder what capacities the people that you left behind there should be developing to help drive that.
Yeah. So the NCDMB, they have a very strong leadership, someone that has experience in the oil and gas industry and was part of the founding system for developing the policies in the industry. So Mr. Simbi Wubute, that is right there, has that. He was part of the visioning of the 10-year program that started in 2010. He set up another 10-year program for his own team, and they are on year 3. So they're following a strategic roadmap designed along with one of the international consultants. But it needs to be seen not only from an oil and gas industry perspective, not only from NCDMB's profile, it's got to permeate to other sectors. And even the academia, I've also proposed to the Lagos Business School that they should have programs on local content. The Emerald Institute, Energy Institute in Port Harcourt has a master's program that I lecture on local content development, not only for the oil and gas industry, but the whole concept. Because we found out that part of the problem in the oil industry was that the executives didn't even believe that it was necessary to do some of the things we were planning to do until we engaged them continuously. Once they saw the importance of what we're trying to do from NNPC and from NCDMB, they bought into the thing. The indigenous producers had issues, oh, it's going to be too costly. I used to have fights with Avora. We said, yes, it's okay what you're planning to do, but it shouldn't be used to kill indigenous producers because we don't have money. We don't have a big tank of money. But guess what? We cannot get these things going in this country if we do not domiciliate the activities and get things going here. We make a factory to manufacture pipes for oil and gas. It's costing so much money to do that. The only way it can become profitable and affordable is if we make sure that water pipes are also made here.
That's the scope economies I was talking about. Yes.
Yeah. So yeah. these things can happen. And in NCDMB cannot go and talk to the Minister of Transport. Oh, you must build your train coaches in Nigeria. You can't go to the water resources man and say, oh, you cannot start awarding contracts in Abuja to do pipes without using made in Nigerian pipes. There has to be some coordinating unit that will look at this local content thing. It cannot be sustained by the oil industry alone. So we need to get people in the universities, people who are doing MBAs, to teach executives, people who are taking decisions, people who are leading their various industries, that it's not just talking about use made in Nigeria. It's not about creating jobs and making a budget to pay people salaries. We need to create productive jobs. There's a difference between just giving people work and paying them salaries every month and creating a system that creates knowledge-based jobs. That unit needs to be there. It's got to be into our universities, into our leadership training academies, and in the ministries. Everybody has to understand that the only way we can succeed is if we now start producing some of those things. Like Solari said about air conditioners, and when we just award contracts to bring in GE equipment from abroad and install in Nigeria, we're not doing local content. We need to start creating shop floors here. And it's not only for the oil and gas industry. The shop floors will drive knowledge, they will drive innovation, they will make it possible for us to learn how to do these things, and then it is sustainable. Otherwise, when we don't do that, we're going to end up again, when we have a fault in a refinery, we have to go and look for the people that built the refinery 20 years ago.
Right. Let me turn to Austin. Yeah, in looking at the future, and let's look at content and linkages now beyond just direct, even in finance, all of those things that come together to make it possible for an indigenous oil company to truly. What are the challenges, and how do you see this playing into the future, and what should we be doing?
Thank you, Prof. Let me actually first of all link this back to your first question about this energy transition that has become a panic button all of a sudden. Everybody now sounds as if in the next 10 years we won't find a place to send our crude oil to. Let me just give some basic statistics. In the most aggressive transition to sustainable energy, that's away from fossil fuels, by 2050, oil and gas will be contributing 35% to the energy mix in the most aggressive, which we call the net zero situation, which is if by 2050, carbon footprint is zero. That's the most aggressive. Oil and gas will still be accounting for about 35% of the energy mix. In the more likely case where footprint will still be reduced, we'll be reducing the energy footprint, the carbon footprint by 70%. Oil and gas will still be in the 50% range. Remember that fossil fuels today, as we speak, account for 81% of the energy mix, in spite of all the noise. And I'm bringing this into the proper perspective so that we understand that even by 2050, oil and gas is not going away. That's one. Two, now all of the aggressive investments in renewable energy, most of it is investment away from oil and gas. So even in the reduced demand case by 2050, even in the reduced demand case for oil and gas, the supply side is going to become very tight because of very low funding into it. So again, by 2050, 30 years from now, we'll be talking about a basket of energy sources, because no matter what we do, this growing population by 2050, the world will be 9.2 billion people. There's a certain quantum of energy that is required to sustain that population. And oil and gas will be in that mix as it is today, domineering. We may no longer be domineering, but it will be in that mix. Now, how do we bring it back to where we are? Now, for 60 years, the multinational companies have taken oil and gas out of here and most parts of the third world to address their own domestic energy security needs, whether it is electricity, whether it's combustion, name it. So while they were doing this, what oil and gas was doing for us was just revenue collection, or just rent. So that 200 million people have only 4,000 megawatts of electricity. Mm-hmm. The entire Africa has 600 million people that don't have electricity. So that we don't jump into the bandwagon of solving other people's problems when we are talking about renewable energy. We should take advantage of the energy transition to then look inwards and solve our problems. This country will need 3 BCF of gas a day to deliver 15 megawatts of electricity. We're still doing 1.1 BCF domestic consumption. So rather than panic that our oil will have no place, let us realize that it is now, especially with indigenous capacity being built, that we need our gas more than anything else as our contribution to renewable energy, to energy transition. So our own idea of energy transition as Nigerians shouldn't be focused on nuclear like you find in France and other places. Neither should it be focused on wind. It should be focused on how best should we use our gas to solve our energy problems. We are still importing petroleum products from crude oil that was exported from here. Those are the solutions that we should first of all address. That is domestic energy security. And we have seen from experience that domestic energy security will not be created for you by multinationals. Only indigenous companies will create domestic energy security. Other than NNPC, nobody has had the courage to build a huge refinery until a Nigerian decided to venture into it. It is the same thing. So some of us are doing LPG on a small scale. The reason is, once this economy, any product whose currency is in Naira, the multinationals are not going to be interested. They will pay lip service to it. So if we are going to address domestic energy security, that's where the emphasis that Ernest and everybody is placing on indigenization. That's where it comes in. It is only the local companies that are here. This is our economy. This is our place. We are the ones who are going to solve that problem. So that's why I'm linking where indigenous participation comes into play in this energy transition.
That's particularly important in terms of the economic strategy that we will roll out as a country. I am of the view, even if the world has completely moved out of fossil fuels, that hydrocarbons will still be base for a lot of product outputs that the whole world will use. And that is why my view is that the economic strategy that we should deploy is one that builds industrial policy around our latent comparative advantage on certain factor endowments. And clearly hydrocarbons are a factor endowment for us. And this is the point I was really trying to make when I was asking Ernest the question earlier, is how do we ensure that we create indigenous capacity as part of Nigerian content development, if you will, to begin to take this further forward. Even if it's not on that global agenda, we can produce value that will into value chains, go into the global markets out of hydrocarbons. And that we need to begin to create the capacity now to engage those.
Just 1 30-second. Yeah.
Sure.
Just 1 30-second piece, Prof, before you move on. One little thing I wanted to say is that, so the critical thing is to move our oil and gas industry from being a rent contributor to the national economy to being an enabler of the national economy. And the leading product for that is gas, followed by crude oil that is refined here and not exported. If you check your national budget data from 2018, 2019, and 2020, oil and gas contribution to the federal budget is sliding towards the 40% mark, even now, even without energy transition. So a combination of high costs and sometimes low prices are now such that oil and gas contribution are no longer in the 70s and 80% of national budget. In 2019, it was 47%. In 2020, it's about 39% of national budget. That's how it's grinding down. So even on its own, it's moving away from being just a revenue contributor. It has to become an enabler. So that when 3 BCF of gas is consumed domestically, what it does to the larger economy, whether it is fertilizers, whether it is petrochemicals, fertilizer then go into agriculture, so that those things then enable the larger economy, and companies' income tax will take its proper place as the main driver of the national budget and not just to rent from oil and gas. That's where we should be moving to.
Very, very, very important perspective. Thanks so very much. I'll take some comments from Dr. Ihe too, and then Engineer Mansour Ahmed again, and then come back to Otumba to close. Dr. Goswili
Can you
Cage.
hear me?
Yeah, okay.
Hello?
Yeah, but a
Can
little
you hear me?
raising of the volume.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yes, okay. Once again, I want to thank you, Pat, for organizing this forum. I have learned quite a bit, even though I'm an industry player, and I'm sure that those of us not in the industry have also learned quite a bit. I thank all the contributors for the way they have, illuminated us all, educated us. I want to talk about two things. I think it was Mansour who raised the issues of policy and regulation. I think one thing we have to note is that our regulator has had a very bad history. When NNPC was created, the regulator was tucked into NNPC. So the regulator was within the operator. Now it took like another 10 years before the regulator was removed from NNPC. And the regulator since then has been trying to find its feet. The PIB was supposed to have helped the regulator to actually be an effective regulator. But we've seen how the PIB has taken, I don't know, more than 10 years to be in place, and it's still not in place. So I think that it is important for the regulator not to see itself as a policeman, which is a word that I often hear, the policeman of the industry. Because of that tag, the regulator now tends to see itself as a policeman. I'd like to emphasize what has been said, I think, by Austin Avuru, regarding the fact that the regulator is not just there to police, but it should be there to also articulate policies. Yeah. In the issue of policy making in the industry, what I have found is that there is no long-term consistency of vision. There is an inconsistency of vision, changing with each minister or president that comes and they talk about their 9-point, 7-point agenda and all that. The focus on the national vision is not there. Now, talking about local content, I'm inclined, having heard from Ernest, that in fact, we should have a ministry of local content that should be coordinating all these gains that we've made in the petroleum industry in other areas, telecoms, utilities, and so on. Without a focus, each ministry will deal with this in its own way, and it will be like inventing the wheel all the time without building on something that we now have. Lastly, I just want to talk about the independent marketers. Unfortunately, when we talk about the industry, we tend to forget the downstream, the marketing people, the distributors, which are very important in making sure that we all have petrol in our stations and LPG gas, to buy for our domestic use. When the independent marketers policy was introduced, the majors, who were mainly Mobil, Shell, and all of those, were kicking against it. They thought there would be a devaluation in quality. But over time, what we've seen is that these independent marketers have actually grown. Some are even thinking of building refineries. So these interventions, I think, are very important. And then lastly, the issue of the impact of the marginal field policy, where companies like Seplat have grown out of it because Austin Avro was a marginal field operator before he came to Seplat. And by the way, the Seplat chairman is probably one of those we'll call a cowboy, maybe. He is a doctor, but he's been an entrepreneur in the petroleum industry. So we shouldn't, restrict this industry to engineers, petroleum engineers, and geologists. We should leave it open and make sure, as has been said, that the regulator insists that standards be kept. I think that's the much I wanted to say. But I wanted to add actually that the marginal fields. If you take a company like Walter Smith, Walter Smith is an independent, it's a marginal field operator in Imo State. It has now built a refinery. It will be using some of its own crude oil and will be also buying crude oil from those around them. They are thinking of going into petrochemicals. They've been able to borrow money from African AFC, African what?
Afrexim Bank or
no,
African Development Bank?
The AFC, what was
AFC, the African Finance Corporation.
African Finance Corporation on their own. And even the local content board has taken some equity, in trying to, help them grow. The Walter Smith is thinking of building industrial parks within Imo State. So they have such ambitions that would not have been there if the marginal field program had not been developed. Thank you.
Thank you. We'll take Engineer Mansour Ahmed quickly.
Am I unmuted? Can you hear me?
Yes, can I hear you?
Very good. Thank you very much. I want to make two quick comments. One on the energy transition, or if you like, the future of the oil and gas industry. Now, when I made a comment on the chat that perhaps this conversation should be taking place, if not exclusively among the younger generation, but perhaps there should be many of them in here. Now, I'm 73, so I'm one of you. Don't think I'm criticizing. The fact is, we are thinking, our aspirations is driven by our experiences. And these experiences are past experiences. So whatever we say today really will be colored by the past. Now, let's get people who are currently trying to grow in the industry, because it is their future we're talking about. They are the ones who are looking at their future now. And they should therefore be in better place to aspire and to think and to begin to plan for that future. Now, the energy transition and the future is already in place. It's already taking place. But it's not only in the oil and gas industry that there will be transition. There will be transition in every industry. Indeed, there is transition taking place in every industry. Take the finance industry we're talking about. Now we know the finance industry itself is indeed threatened by fintech. And I have no doubt that this kind of movement will take place in the industry. So asking the oil and gas people to decide their future, what about the people who will disrupt that future are actually from outside the oil and gas industry? So we really need to see the future in that context. Now, I hear what Austin Ovuru said about the fact that, yes, we still have time, but that time is already going. And every year we pass is changing the next 10 years. So if today we can see that the next 50 years we will still have oil and gas, we will still have demand for oil, who guarantees that? Maybe within the next 5 years, what he thinks is going to happen in 50 years may happen in 10 years. And we've seen it happen. We have seen it in our telecoms industry. We are now seeing it in our aviation industry. We will see it in the oil and gas industry for sure. So we need to begin to consider what is likely going to be that future. And it is not going to be 50 years, believe me. It's not going to be 30 years. It's starting tomorrow. Now, let me also talk about the issue of regulation, because I think that is really critical. Our regulators all along in every industry, and it's not just in oil and gas, in every industry have regarded themselves as gatekeepers.
Yep.
Or indeed, and what they should be midwives who are trying to help grow the industry. They are not to see themselves as tax collectors or revenue collectors. That is to grow the industry so that it can generate the revenue for those that have the responsibility to collect revenues. That is, I think, the key thing we must target in whatever transformation we want to bring into our regulatory environment. If we don't change our regulators to see themselves as midwives, helping to grow, to nurture and grow the industry in every industry they are, whether it's agriculture, oil and gas, or aviation, we must expect that we will continue to have the same problem of distorted policy, distorted and unimplementable policies. Lastly, if I can say so, the key, I believe, issues we must look at today is how can we transform the industry more towards private sector operation, private sector control, private sector direction. Because at the end of the day, we are seeing it happen in every industry. The more we transfer the industry into private hands, the more it moves and the quicker it transforms. Take your oil and gas, your telecoms industry today. 20 years ago, nobody would ever think that we'll have the telecom industry today that we had, that we have now. And this is because this movement towards private sector, which virtually has eliminated the public sector ownership and control of the industry virtually. And I believe that when we do that, we will find that even regulation will change, because the industry will be driven more by internal regulation, self-regulation, if you like, which is a faster and more effective way of regulation than by public sector regulation. And I believe that these are some of the key issues we really need to focus on and drive our thoughts and our discussions and our conversation around, so that as those of us who go into policymaking and who go into lawmaking can then begin to actually move in the right direction. Thank you very much.
Thank you so very much. Last, by the way, to say that this conversation about Nigerian or indigenous participation is going to go on for the next 2 sessions, and we're going to focus in one of the sessions on the downstream, because it's such a huge area, we can't cover it all completely. I mean, all the sectors, subsets, pipelines, and all the other indigenous participation play areas that need to be flushed out some more for younger players to see opportunity and to engage. I think we'll ask some of us if we could find some more time, but this has really been a thrill. But we'll go to Otumba for the last word, because we have to close now. Your general reflections on the future and getting further knock on from the industry on economic growth in the country generally, rather than just extracting rent. If you're mute.
Thank you. I think the point has been well made about the energy transition, and I like the comforting comment that there's no cause for alarm. I don't share, of course, that 2050 is a long time. Maybe a long time for us as participants on this forum or as human beings, but in the life of the world, it's a very short time. I believe very strongly that energy transition should be taken seriously. No immediate threat to the hydrocarbon demand, I agree completely. But you will take, say, countries like, or companies like BP, Big Petroleum, they've taken a decision 20 years ago to change their name from British Petroleum to Beyond Petroleum. They've seen the need to start articulating a policy towards energy transition from the hydrocarbon. And I think we should take that as a policy statement at the government level. I believe that the energy mix, for example, should not be heavily on fossil fuel alone, but we should also develop very strongly alternative energy sources. And I think that if you look at it together, a very interesting thing happening in this economy is that we are stunted by average production of crude oil at about 1.8. It went down to 1.3 before, 1.5, maybe 1.6. Changes according to several varieties. Why have not been able to wrap up our production? The highest I understand before was about 5 million barrels per day. Why are we just stuck about 2.1, 2.2, 1.8? The same thing is happening in the power sector, electricity sector. We were doing about 5 megawatts, 5,000 megawatts before. Now it's about 3.2, 3.8 megawatts, 4 megawatts. For decades, I'm just trying to say that the energy mix and the structural imbalance, this problem, inertia that is there, had to be looked at very seriously. Quickly on energy transition, I think that two things are going to really derive that in the next couple of 24 months. I think the elephant in the room is the new PIB bill. I think it's going to be a very structural change in the landscape in the oil industry. We have to start looking at it very, very seriously. If it's passed by the Senate and the House and they harmonize their positions, it's going to have a very strong on the fiscal monetary policy and the sector, even development programs. The second one, I think, in terms of transition or immediate impact, not transition actually, is the commissioning of the Dangote refinery and the impact for the downstream sector. Is going to be quite dramatic. You have to be prepared for that. And I think that those two critical elements in the next 24 months are the real thing that are going to happen. Beyond that, I'm happy that you're going to look at the downstream sector at the next session, which I think is very important because that's probably the kind of conversation you have everywhere. Even Petroleum Club, where I belong, is only the upstream sector that are dominating conversation. You don't really get to talk about the downstream sector. And when you look at the impact on the economy, in terms of the knock-on effect of the economy, by a large measure of any index, the upstream sector is like a colony outside Nigeria, with all respect.
Yeah, that's very true.
On the economy is in terms of employment, in terms of value chain, in terms of supply chain structure, in terms of institutions, in terms of facilities, in terms of landscaping the whole economy. This is an issue we have to look at. Of course, the capacity to build refinery, petrochemicals, storage facilities, pipelines, and then build them to expand to the whole country will also energize, will also build the impact of the downstream sector more than what we are having now. But let the conversation continue. I really believe that for this discussion this evening, it has really stimulated a lot of discussions and thoughts on a couple of things. And if, sorry to use this word, if Nigeria does not show up, i.e., the challenges of this country, survivability, issues of security, issues of the country being able to still exist, the situation is very bright. If Nigeria does not show up in terms of all those obvious baggages we are carrying that are beyond the oil industry. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you so very much. A great bouquet of thanks around to all the panelists and participants. We're looking to have this as just part of a continuation in our conversation and we'll be in touch with all of you. And we look forward to further conversation. Kola Karim is probably hanging around somewhere in on this platform. Wanted him to say some words, but he will probably feature more strongly in the next episodes that are coming. So appreciate you very much and look to speaking with you again next time. Have a pleasant evening. Okay, so